Hello, and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 12th of September 2022. I have to say, I'm struggling not to say 12th of September 1984 because that's the day after my birthday. So it is the week of the 12th of September 2022, and I'm joined as ever by my rather well-lit co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning. I'm being beautifully sidelit by the sunshine here in southeast London.
Yeah, like a performance artist. You could sort of like the light and the dark of the soul, or Two-Face or something, a Batman villain.
I shall conduct the rest of the watching brief through the medium of interpretive dance.
Exactly, that's a good. Yeah, excellent. Well, it's also sunny up here in the northeast of England, and it's left me curious now as to how sunny it might be when we add our guest for today's watching brief to this call. Eagle-eyed viewers at home will be aware that the background is different for this particular watching brief, and that's because we're recording directly from Zoom because we have a special guest who has recently published a book on treasure, and it ties in quite nicely with the sort of the mini series that Andy brought forth recently on Watching Brief. That is to say that we need to talk about metal detecting, treasure, and also the archaeology of death. Some of you may have already guessed who this might be. That is, of course, Howard Williams, Professor Howard Williams himself. And we shall add him to the call now.
Okay, brilliant.
Oh, here he is. Audio connecting. He's arriving.
I'm here.
He's here. Hooray. Hello, Howard. Hello. Good morning.
Hello. How are you both?
We're okay. Of course, you know Andy. You've met him at
Hi, Andy.
At secret soirees where Big Heritage pays us off not to talk about aliens.
You're supposed to keep quiet.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
We're all in a secret society.
What am I going to say to Biden when I meet him when he's over for the royal funeral?
I don't know. I mean, just do the handshake and then just just wink. It'll be fine. Okay. Anyway, sorry. Hello.
I'm sure we'll get away with it.
Yes. Nothing to. Sorry. You've done a book.
Nothing to see here. Ancient
conspiracy
within absolutely.
Conspiracy within conspiracy within conspiracy. There's so many going on. I forget which one who I'm lying about and covering up. From day to day. It's it's the burden of lies.
It is. It's difficult.
Guys, do you think we ought to pretend we're archaeologists now and just get on with the subject we're meant to be talking about?
Yes. Archaeologists as opposed to social engineers. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, what was it? You've done a book.
Yes, I have.
You've done a book. There you go.
Okay, yeah. Well, I can tell you about that if you like.
Yeah.
So I've been doing every year a series of student conferences where the students in my third year group on a course called Archaeology Contemporary Society, as part of their assessment, they have to organise, research a topic and present individually themselves at a public conference, a day conference. And we've been recording most of them on video, but then for those who want to, we've been taking those conference proceedings through to publication with the keynotes at the conference, with other invited guests and some of the student papers themselves. So it simultaneously is a exercise in public engagement, a pedagogic exercise for the students, and we've tried to address with each conference and each publication a different original theme in archaeological research, particularly public archaeology. Mm-hmm. So the fifth and final book, we did 6 conferences, but I've kind of given up. This is the 5th one I'm going to take to publication, and this is the final one out. This 5th and final one that's out this month is called The Public Archaeology of Treasure. And we thought there would be a massive amount of literature on this. And while there are existing pieces of published academic research on the illicit trade in antiquities, the debates about metal detecting, that broader sort of set of pop culture, political and legal connections with archaeological theory, practice and public engagement really hasn't had any edited collection addressing it. So not only is it a first for me addressing this topic as an editor, and I've got a chapter in the book as well, but I've learned a lot as the process has gone on since the conference in early 2020. It's also, I think, really almost by accident, I think, hit a really timely and important theme where I thought this would be, to be honest with you, to be absolutely candid with you, there's never been a time when I've been at university as a student or as a lecturer and I've not had to deal with and teach about metal detecting, trade in antiquities. So over the last 23 years or 28 years, if you include being a student, I've never had to, it's always been there. And it's a bit like, oh God, that old chestnut, I better teach that again. That'll go away. And it doesn't go away because we, and there's always new stories, new challenges, new popular representations in fiction. So yeah, it somehow has, I think, come out at perhaps the right or the wrong time. I don't know. That's still to be judged. But the book is out now.
New TV shows.
And I get.
Yeah, well, indeed.
Yeah. We'll come to that later. And I know you've got a new YouTube discussion out with our good friend Archaeosoup as well, haven't you?
Yes, because she did a TikTok and I reacted and said we should talk about this further, and so that's what came out of that. Yes.
Yeah,
we'll come.
We'll come on to that, and I'll come back at the end to the way you've produced the book as well, because I find that really interesting too, and I think it's worth exploring for our for our viewers. And I think I should also do credit to your co-editors, Peter Reevell, the former FLO for Shropshire, I think, and in West Midlands, and also Samuel Clegg, who you work with on this. So it's a proper cooperative production, isn't it?
Absolutely. I've tried to do all of this project collaborative, both with, in this case, obviously Peter is a well-established, he was an FLO, he's moved jobs now, but he was our keynote, he was our discussant at the conference, and so he joined the editorial team. But also I had two students on board who, because of their circumstances with COVID, couldn't keep up on the editorial, but we still gave them credit as joint authors of the introduction. But another student, Sammy Clegg, basically came in for the last year and did a lot of the editing work with me and Peter. So, it's a genuine co-edited product. Yes.
Can I step back then as we begin to talk about it? And we talked about the timing of this particular publication, and but also it happens to have come out at a time when memory, memorialization, the discussion of death is a national issue, obviously, with the death of Queen Elizabeth II last week, where I think the queue in London was stopped this morning when the waiting time was 8 hours. And I'm just wondering, given so much of what we're talking about here is in a number of the papers in the book are about what archaeologists will call grave goods.
Yes.
But how does it feel when your day job is suddenly immersed in national life, if you like? That the kind of thing you think about and talk about all the time is suddenly on the front, on pretty much every front page in the world's media.
It's an interesting phenomenon, isn't it? Because the broader themes I think you're hinting at are things like, what do we value about our historic environment? What do we value about the places, the institutions, not just the monarchy as people, but the places, Holyrood House, St Giles Cathedral, Westminster Hall, Westminster Abbey. These places are part of the phenomenon of the Queen's mourning and funeral, and the broader backdrop of this of excitement about and debates about statues and whether they should be retained and explained or removed, and in portable antiquities. And it is this ultimate hypocrisy of Britain that I think, and I think the Western world more broadly, is people mobilise their passions and interests when things are being attacked, but they really don't invest in them or care about them. And this is where we feel frustration as heritage practitioners and archaeologists, don't we? Where, yes, we see Dorman Long Tower being blown up, or we see these things being debated, but only when they're outside of our control. And it's very frustrating because a lot of the time when we needed to have those conversations about why we need trained archaeologists, why we need to have these conversations about a cultural landscape, no one's interested. And I suppose that's why we're constantly frustrated and angry about these things to some degree. And the other thing for me is I'm at a relatively modest profile university in the northwest of England. And while I do a lot of digital stuff, no one's coming to me to ask my opinion, apart from you guys and maybe occasional journos. I don't get a lot of interest. If I was sitting in UCL, Oxford or Cambridge, I would be up there on Radio 4 every second day, because these themes are chiming. My research is connecting to these conversations. But I think there's a lot of things about, where I am, who I am, that I just don't hit that. I won't be in those broader conversations. At one level, it's really quiet. I can pick and choose what I decide to comment on, as ever. And I'm only commenting on this now because the book has come out. If this had coincided and the book had come out in the summer, I would have just kept absolutely quiet about the new TV programs, the broader discussions about metal detecting, because it's such a minefield of controversy. So at one level, yeah.
Do you think that then that the difference that separates out that sort of generalized sense of puffed up, we must, barrel chested defend our statues, and a day-to-day kind of, I suppose, charitably an unawareness of the totality of what's happening in the heritage sector, shall we say? Yeah. Do you think the difference actually comes in often in the form of treasure, in that sense? So people will it'll be a headline on the BBC, it'll get people talking in various mediums and media, but primarily it's about intrinsic value and worth, isn't it? So even then, it's not actually a true discussion about history and heritage and the work of archaeologists and historians. It's still not quite there. And do you see these sorts of publications or this sort of publication as trying to bridge that sort of gap, that void that's left by sort of the popular conversation surrounding, oh, have you found some treasure? And someone leans over your trench.
And we didn't want to bracket it in simply in terms of the problem of metal detecting or the problem of illicit trading. And we wanted to open it up to a broader conversation that links to public archaeology, media archaeology, discussing how treasure is portrayed in films, how treasure is portrayed on TV. And yes, there are huge gaps in the book, because it's not a Routledge handbook where we went around for 5 years seeking out experts in every part of the globe can address different issues. We're not dealing with the looting of indigenous sites in parts of the Americas, say, for example, or there's lots of gaps in the book, but still with a UK focus, with a mixture of students and practitioners and academics, with different formats of paper, there's interviews, and making it open access and cheap and available. Yes, it's written in an academic style, and it's deep. And I always do quite the long and dense introductions, but I think that is important to situate the stuff, the conversation. But all those points aside, I think we put it out there. With Archaeo Press, downloadable, free, as well as you can purchase a paperback, so that this actually gets used by students, by people who can't afford the next £120, €150 hardback book from whoever, which is what most academic books are coming out as. Yes. And I see, and we see them all the time. Another great book about well-being in archaeology comes out, priced £90. Another book on something really relevant, like, say, military or conflict archaeology, comes at £130, and you go, well, who's going to even read these? And so we did do it that format to reflect the way it came from a conference, but also to respect the fact this needs to be part of a broader conversation. And we wanted to frame it. So the key point is we didn't want to frame the conversation as simply, let's talk about metal detecting again, or let's talk about pillaging of sites again. They're part of the conversation, but a lot of the stuff is mortuary, and so we have paper by Adam Daubney talking about, well, shouldn't we be treating grave goods as a separate category? If we think or know it's from a human grave, and it's been deliberately deposited, why it's another big question within the very lax laws we have. Why isn't that being taken seriously, when simultaneously people say they might look at a war memorial wrong or look at the Queen's coffin in the wrong way, and people are literally tackling them to the ground? I'm being a bit exaggerating here rhetorically, but you know what I mean. There's that level of feeling and care for our historical personages and institutions, even when they're no longer with us. And these names on war memorials they're long passed away. That's why they're on war memorials. And yet we have that sort of sense of care and protection, but it never extends to the broader historic environment. And so, I want those conversations. So yes, the book inevitably means that there's my biases, and there's the other editor's biases, and the author's own takes. But like, we have a paper by Pieta Greaves, who's the principal conservator for the Staffordshire Hoard, and she talks about the massively successful public engagement with the process of conservation, because a lot of it was done in public, with visitors. And whatever you think about the circumstances around discovery of that treasure, that hoard, that find, whether we should call it treasure or not, that was still a massive public coup over the last. It was one of the biggest, most popular finds. People came as usual from America, as they do for Queen's funeral. People come there. Someone's come from America, but also people did come from around the world. They heard about it around the world, and so it's about trying to make sure that the reader gets a sense that this isn't a black and white issue. It's not about treasure, dirty, dangerous term, or the materials that we call treasure are that there's many positive avenues for education and engagement alongside the really critical debates about looting and the legality of these practices. So we try to represent that spectrum, and we hope it starts a new round of debate. Like any publication, it's not ending a story, it's trying to kickstart things again. And I do think it is an indictment on the British academic community that while there's been publications on metal detecting, there hasn't been a single book. Well, there's been one or two, but there's not been a single book that puts that in a broader context of the as this does. So I'm sure it will get critical reviews, and that's good. And I hope it inspires new work. But I think it does. We do try to take it a little bit broader and tackle some the connections between the specific legal issues and the broader connotations of treasure.
That's a really interesting point I'd like to take up with you, actually, because I think one of the things reading the book, one of the things that strikes me about it, one of the underlying themes, is the fact that archaeologists are really uncomfortable with what we might call the T word, treasure.
Yeah.
And yet we're stuck with it, partly because, the search for buried treasure has been a trope in mythologies all over the world, from Jason and the Argonauts to, you name it. Most cultures have a folk tale about some buried something important that somebody goes in search of. And also academics have tried to engage with the public on the grounds that something is treasure, and it's the treasure of knowledge.
Yes.
Trouble is, we've not always been very good at, or even tried to separate the two. And how do you resolve that one, or can we ever resolve that one?
Well, I in the introduction to the book, I try to set up that and talk about how even in our most popular representations, even in the Indiana Jones story, treasure is part of a moral compass that differentiates the good guy from the bad guy. Who will see that treasure is deceptive and that there's a real truth or spiritual truth or knowledge that can be gained? And that is just that's the trope of those films, in my view. It's not about archaeology, it's about spiritual. It's about morality and spiritual connection, and treasure is integral to that. Who picks up the right goblets and what their expectations of what treasure will be, through to treasure that will blow your scientist brain apart at the end of the fourth film, if anyone remembers it.
Yes.
So it's like not being able to look at or the knowledge is spiritual. And that, so you have this. I think that's already baked into the cake of our popular conception. And archaeologists, I think, often ham-fistedly deal with it. Sometimes they don't deal with it at all. They stick to a very hard line of, we don't deal with that. We don't talk about that. We don't use the T word. We don't use the... And other times, I think there's interesting game playing done by archaeologists in using the term, but mobilizing it in a very clear bracket or very clear structure of what we mean by that. And I think we've seen some good examples. The one I picked out in the introduction, sorry to pick on a TV production, but is in Great British Dig, where in episode 1, where they're up near up on Hadrian's Wall, and they're finding objects. And I think there are multiple times they refer to bits of Roman Samian ware or equivalent wheel-thrown pottery as treasures. What treasures are we finding here? No one's going to misunderstand in the context of that program that these are not treasures, and that they could be using it as a joke. They're not, but they are using it to deliberately frame this as things they want to find that are going to tell them something. And I winced when I saw that, and I'm not saying I approve of that use. I'm just saying I see archaeologists trying to play this game on TV, in their public engagement. I was recently at the English Heritage site of Beeston Castle in Cheshire, which is a prehistoric hill fort and 13th century plus castle, English Civil War, and they've got a well there, and there's a little sign saying the hidden treasure, and it's talking about a folklore of, I can't remember the details, folklore of treasure in the well. And because the well is gated off, there's no health and safety risk that someone's going to dive straight in a 130-foot well to retrieve the treasure, because it's impossible, and it's safe in the sense that it's so far up and enclosed within a protected historic site. This is not going to foster treasure hunting as such, and the sign explains this is folklore. And for me, that's whether you like the term or not, that's an obviously responsible, fun way of engaging kids in the story of a place, or an aspect of the story of the place, that isn't going to lead to real world ramifications or misunderstandings. So I think we have to take it on a case by case basis, to use the old cliche, and realize that archaeologists and heritage practitioners are aware of this. Most of them are being canny in the way they use it. I'm not saying they don't use it badly sometimes, but I think there is a lot of potential with the careful use of these terms, as long as we're aware, as long as we don't pretend that term has a dangerous legacy. And we have our history as treasure hunters in terms of the deep history of the origins of archaeology, and we shouldn't own that as a badge of pride, but we should be aware of that as a part of what our discipline has done and is still at its core. In some ways, not in every way, but in the sense of we are still, as a community, part of that world where there are museums full of looted stuff, and so we can't deny that is part of the story of archaeology. So I think not using the term is not a way to go, but equally bandying it around as if it doesn't matter and the public like it is a pretty irresponsible thing to do. So I sit in between, really in the middle between that. As usual, I'm the kind of lukewarm water between the fire and ice, to use a Spinal Tap term in these issues. I sit in the middle of these things, but I see the careful use being deployed. At least I hope they did it consciously and with recognition of what they were doing. But I think the problem with TV programs or any of these things, though, is that it shouldn't be just left there. There should be follow-up. There should be resources so that people can then go, when we said this on site, what did we mean by that? And you could have a podcast or a YouTube or a discussion that draws off that. And often that's what's with TV productions and also with other popular engagements on heritage sites. That's what's missing. When we set up the top of the castle treasure, what did we mean by that? Find out in the treasure trail, where we discuss what treasure is. And I think that's often where the conversation is a missed opportunity. I think the public engagement is a missed opportunity to take that term and then use it as an educational device, a teachable moment. That was a ramble, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Actually, you mentioned the media, and you have a paper in the book by Sophie Brown where she compares the Tutankhamun excavation, which we're observing the 100th anniversary of this year. It happened in 1922. And the excavation at Prittlewell in Essex a few years ago, and the so-called Prittlewell prints. And the compares and contrasts the coverage of those two events as sort of media events, really. And one of the things, again, that struck me with that was, first of all, how the idea of Tutankhamun has become a shorthand.
Yeah.
But also she talks about the curse of the pharaoh and how that was concocted by the media, basically to sell copies. And yet it's given rise to a whole genre of curse of documentaries on digital TV channels, for a start. The Curse of Oak Island and so on, of happy and ongoing memory. So, and also, I suppose the other irony about the Tutankhamun exhibition, and we can come on to legalities in a minute, but it's now the story that Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon may have, shall we say, broken the law at the time by removing artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb and effectively laundering them back to the UK, has re-emerged. So the good guys weren't necessarily the good guys. There are complexities here, aren't there?
Well, but also as well, I'm sorry, I remember in that story very early on, I think even before I went to university, reading about the likelihood that they were so anxious about the pressure surrounding this treasure that they actually went into the tomb the night before they opened the tomb in front of the world's press. So along with that sort of iconic discovery came at the time this immense pressure to to deliver in that sense as well.
Yes, and I think therefore rooted in the very beginnings of our excitement in the 20th century about treasures from tombs, is the very problem, isn't it? And that's where I find those parallels. I mean, a lot of people objected to the Mola press release likening the Prittlewell prints to the Tutankhamun finds as Britain's Tutankhamun, because firstly it was a repeat of what was said about Sutton Hoo in 1939, but also because of the connotations and the royal treasury. I mean, I was actually, I was wishy-washy on that. I could see why they did that, but I think again it leads us down a particular avenue, and particularly when it deals with objects that were selected for the dead. I think, yes, that is deeply troubling, the way that was framed, I think, and how that was then narrated. And that sense of national importance, that trying to give it an international, but national within an international scene of the status of those objects, I think, as beyond the context in which they're found. It's, again, something that frustrates archaeologists, when the objects become more important than the context, when the bling becomes more important than the story.
I don't know what you mean, Stonehenge. I have no idea. No idea what you're talking about, Stonehenge. A watching brief is a formal programme of observation and investigation to record and report on notable discoveries on an archaeological site. As part of our ongoing watching brief, Andy and I work hard to bring you the best, the worst, and sometimes the more quirky happenings from the world of archaeology. We aim to provide a space where voices can be heard, opinions shared, and sometimes truth spoken to power. If you believe in the work we do, please consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 per month. Thank you.
So as we commence the downhill slope in the discussion, as it were, we've covered a lot of ground already. Thank you again, Howard, for giving us your time this morning and being so erudite about a subject, as you say, which is actually, although it's front and center of a lot of archaeological discussion, is underrepresented in the literature. So I do think this is a valuable book, and I'm not just saying that. I'm not just saying that because you thank Marc and I in the introduction for previous
you were very
conversations
helpful on many because you got finger on the pulse. There's so many new stories. I think that people are scared of it, and I think, if I may just cut into and also say, people, it's changing. The picture's changing so much. It's difficult to fix a point. So I did appreciate both your input on this, because I can't keep up with the news stories the way you guys do, and I don't know how you do it. But I needed to know that I wasn't already out of date when I was. There's always things I miss, but so I do appreciate your input. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. And I think it's important to put cards on the table, so we're not entirely neutral in discussing this. But I'd like to step back and take the long view, if you like. One of the papers that struck me very much was Sharon Green's paper about reflecting on the treasure and the legalities of treasure, and the public image, the national image of treasure from an Irish point of view, the Republic of Ireland.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me very strongly reading that was that in the 1980s, while British archaeologists, many British archaeologists, were trying, and it must be said, failing to get metal detecting controlled, there was a campaign called Stop, which was trying to ban metal detecting for archaeological objects, and utterly failed. Whereas in Ireland, the government of Ireland took a very conscious decision to impose what metal detectorists see as absolutely draconian laws, in that you cannot, in the Republic of Ireland, detect for archaeological objects without a license. And that means being part of an archaeological project, basically. Yeah. And that all objects that are archaeological objects that are found are the property of the Irish state. So, within a common travel area, we have these two very different views of how hobby metal detecting should be handled. What do you make of that that difference? Two nations divided by a common language and common laws on metal detecting.
my take on it is obviously not Sharon's. Sharon came to the conference and was very keen to contribute, and I was very grateful. We lack a Scottish perspective in the book, I shall say, to preface what I say, and that is a weakness. And we lack many other countries, but I think Sharon's paper helps to show that the situation in the UK is not inevitable. There are other avenues we could take, as other comparative published discussions have done over the last decade and a half, looking at Poland, Denmark, Sweden, elsewhere. That's my first takeaway from her paper. The second takeaway paper is that how much our attitudes to treasure are enshrined not only in legal terms, but in cultural terms, and related to senses of entitlement and senses of ownership and senses of land ownership. And while, of course, and that basically the Irish Republic is a post-colonial nation that's had to push back from a state level and a cultural level against hundreds of years of colonial rule. And I don't know if I can't recall if Sharon says it's quite so starkly, but I think that it has to be taken into account in understanding the differences there. And it would be interesting. I mean, I don't know if this sounds preposterous to listeners, but when Scotland becomes an independent nation, which I think is almost inevitable now, whether it's in 50 years or 10, it'd be really interesting to see how their attitude to the cultural environment, because we've already seen since devolution massive disparities already in within restricted parameters of differences. And I do wonder whether in Scotland and then maybe in Wales, which has already got different attitudes to heritage on a much lower level, different legal laws have come in 2016, I think it was. I think that we're going to see a more fragmented picture within what is now the UK. But certainly already we can see that stark difference, and it has to be to do with at least in large part, the cultural and colonial story of Ireland. That's my takeaway from that. I don't know what others will think.
Is there a sort of scepter-dial Shakespearean Englishman's home is his castle kind of notion, possibly, that's behind this idea of a sort of entitlement to what you find on your land, or what you find on land that you've been given permission to detect on? And the reason why I say that is that yesterday, for example, on Facebook Marketplace, I've been looking for some shelves. I came across a listing that was recommended to me that was basically a lot of metal crud. There was nothing really particularly interesting, nothing particularly identifiable there. But the guy was going to great pains on the listing to say I had permission to go and metal detect this stuff, and I'm going to sell it on, and serious offers only, all that kind of thing. And I had to remind myself that he does have a right to do that, and that landowner has a right to do that as well. And is it that sort of almost as a quasi-feudal sense of, at some point, this stuff belongs to someone, and you can claim it yourself if you're a citizen?
Well, I can't get my head. I've really struggled to get my head around this because, and whatever I say will perhaps unfairly characterize metal detector users and show my ignorance of the range of people and their interests. But I think one thing that I have to say is that I think there's more parallels with a US style gun lobby of I have the right to bear, in this case, bear detector. It's like a Second Amendment. So I wonder how much of it is actually an American cultural imperialism. I can't say that, but cultural influence. That there's a sense that you can wear your camos and you can go out.
Freedom, Howard. It's freedom.
Freedom isn't free. It involves waving a metal detectorist around field because the landowners aren't the people doing this. So that's why I'm reticent to go down your suggestion. I think it's a really interesting idea because, of course, and you could almost say, oh no, metal detectorists are the working class heroes, like the right to roam. They're going out on Kinder Scout. They're going out to assert their rights to walk on the landowner's land, which they're not doing. They're asking permission. So you can't play it as a working class hero. You can't really play it as a landowner's entitlement. But it is an entitlement. It's a sense of I have a freedom, and I'm going to assert it's finders keepers. And I don't know how much it is British exclusively, but it is a trait we see even within the archaeological community regarding data of finders keepers, that there's some authority from, well, it's in my pocket now. It's in it's just so I don't know if it's I wouldn't characterize it as either American style influence or a British cultural entitlement, landowners' entitlement. I think it's something broader and more woolly than that. But it's certainly, there is a sense. I found it. Now, what do I do with it? Someone else is going to have to pay for it being actually identified. So that's as far as I can go with it. I don't know if anyone else will think differently.
Well, I mean, the main reason why I asked that question is that I thought it was an interesting counterpoint to the characterization of a post-colonial notion of the people, the state, own this stuff. So indirectly, actually, you as the finder already own it because the Irish state owns it, but you are prohibited from personally profiting from it.
There is something laissez-faire about it. The state isn't allowed. It's an area where the state can't. We have a right to do it. So there is a sense that Britain is allowing that flexibility of freedom, like the freedom to do business.
Freedom. It's freedom.
Liberty more than liberty, I think would be the term, isn't it? We're a liberal democracy, allegedly. So that's.
Personally speaking of the discussion about whether there's an American influence here, I would just say to our viewer, watch this space, because I've been doing some work on that area. But anyway, but
I've no idea what you're talking
about. One thing I would to move the discussion on, Howard. Two quick points really. One is that I think it can be argued, particularly after the summer that we've just had, the dial is moving on things like the climate emergency, engagement with the environment. We've got a lot of concern at the moment about sewage in rivers and around our coasts, over problems within the environment. So do you think it's possible there'll be a spillover from that to concern, for example, about the historic environment, not just about building houses and on green field that we often get, but that metal detectorists are dealing with a finite historical resource? And we're already seeing anecdotal reports in the metal detecting media that certain areas have been worked out. They've been metal detected for 30, 40 years now, and there aren't enough objects left to make in certain areas, certain fields, on certain farms, to make it worthwhile people detecting there again. And in fact, metal detecting clubs and rallycos point up in their advertising that allegedly a field or a farm hasn't been detected before. So do you think there'll be some pushback on that? And perhaps stepping back from that even further, do you think there can ever be a full accommodation between professional archaeology as it's practiced now, with the ethical bounds, with the plan, the fact that you have to produce a written scheme of investigation and so on, and this completely laissez-faire wandering across the field, picking something up if you've got permission, and even selling it without even necessarily reporting it, which would be absolutely contrary to every professional archaeological ethic going?
Well, wow, they're big questions. I think I've already seen in the news the rhetoric, and I think it's a canny rhetoric to use, of archaeologists using in the media the idea that our natural resources and our archaeological resources are under threat from climate change, and that this is the treasures. The treasures are the information, the historic landscape itself. So the sceptred isle actually works, that these are our gems, our bogs, our wetlands, our forests, our fields. These are the spaces which we must protect, not simply from one individual landowner wanting to build a house, but from the climate emergency. And I think that should start. I think that's the way, on the back of, through collaboration with environmental lobbyists. I think that is one way where we could position a rather traditional view of the archaeological record as a finite resource that's going to always be threatened, but use that in a productive way to get a message across about the value. And if we are doing that work, it needs to be properly funded, and it needs to be properly resourced, and professionals need to be doing the excavation. So that is my feeling. I think that is a way in which, sad that climate emergency is happening. It's not as if it's a brand new revelation, but where we can, I think, make constructive developments and see archaeology as all of our inheritance that is being squandered through poor practice, through poor decisions and planning and so on. So I do think that is a positive way in which we connect up with environmental lobbyists much more robustly. Your second question, is there ever going to be an
entente cordiale?
A cordiality? Well, according to the rhetoric of some institutions, there already is there is already a happy arm-in-arm collaboration between archaeologists and metal detectorists, and we know that
you're talking particularly about the portable antiquity scheme, of course.
Yes, and but they are having to do that because that's within the restrictions of what they do, and they have no alternative but to press again and again that narrative that there is just goodwill and collaboration. I think genuinely, and if I was going to put my money, money where my mouth is, I said we can only achieve this through a more robust system of management of metal detecting, but also a more robust and better funded system of reporting those finds that builds on the success of the portable antiquity scheme, overhauls it, gives it much more money and resources to do that job. I can't see we can continue with the mess on both sides of allowing metal detecting to go into massive rallies and simultaneously having incrementally underfunded because of all the inflation and other things, scheme where the museums that support them and all the infrastructure is being taken away. So if this is going to be taken seriously, I think that the basics are there, but change needs to come. I would also say in that regard that I think simultaneously TV shows like Digging for Treasure are potentially the language they're using, despite, it was difficult to watch for me as an archaeologist. I'm sure it was cringe to watch for you, but if we, it wasn't aimed at us, but actually the language in which they're talking about metal detectorists on that program, if sincere and if accurate, is the basis of a proper of how the system should work. It's an idealized fiction maybe, but it's certainly showing how this hobby is doing amateur history hunting that is contributing, as they said, citizen science to an archaeological database that is then resourced not only to have a database, but for people to actually research that database and that database to be of a quality that we can use. Now, I know that's a bit of there's lots of buts in there, but I think that narrative is there. That story is there through that one TV program. And I've got many criticisms of the TV program, but I think, if you want to take something positive from that, despite the fragmentary story, despite the problems with it, that narrative there of working class people finding everyday finds that tell about everyday past people, so the everyday man or everyday woman finding the everyday things about the everyday past, is the way we are already talking about as a community of archaeologists professionally about what we should be doing. So in many ways, that program takes the language of archaeologists and is trying to bolt treasure hunting into it. And it may not be a perfect fit at the moment, but I think that has to be the way we take it forward. Is we are already doing citizen science, so just make sure we've got a structure and the funding in place to make that work.
In a lot of this conversation, we've been talking about perceptions. We've talked about the media and so on. And I'm going to mention the D word now, because in the discussion in the forward, and again, I do urge people to buy the book, ideally download the PDF. If you but the in the forward, which is very densely argued and very well argued, I can say, but you allude to that BBC TV series Detectorists, created by Mackenzie Crook. It's been massively successful. As I understand it, there's a Christmas special in production for so the characters are being revisited, if you like. But it was, and you talk about how that is as false a view of metal detecting as is the view of an archaeologist as being somebody who wears a very brightly coloured jumper or wears tweeds and a pipe. So what I'm saying, both sides of this particular discussion are being misrepresented in the media.
Oh, yeah.
How do you resolve that one?
Well, I think you can take a lot of things out of Detectorists that are positive and kind and nice and fun and funny, and also the fact that even when they find something valuable, it's kind of a Toby Jones's character feels totally disillusioned when it ends up in the British Museum and then feels a sense actually spiritually cursed and must sort of it all gets a bit weird and has to sort of pay back the land for his removing it. And so, I mean, whether you think that spiritual element is there too. So I think there's it plays with lots of fun ideas. But at the end of the day, the thing that disturbs me about the Detectorists is that they failed to discover a funerary site. They're actually trying to find a grave in the first season, and in the third season they do find indirectly via magpies a grave, a Roman grave. And that idea that treasure is associated with a grave, I think is still really, and there's a whole joke sequence about a metal detectorist who puts things in his grave, I think, and it being accidentally disturbed. And I can't remember the details of the joke, but there is still an equation of treasure with intentionally deposited objects that have meaning and value, and that is both very positive but also rather worrying that people then see that as something we are entitled to take. So I do think the program is fun and interesting, but it's not without its lessons for us, I think. And I think certainly I feel metal detectorists have won the PR war. And but it's not just about metal detectorists, because we've got on the horizon a dramatization of the discovery of Richard III's grave, and which I think a lot of archaeologists are very nervous about how archaeologists get portrayed in that. So it's not just about the detectorists. I think almost everyone but the archaeologist gets a good write-up, and we're left with Indiana Jones. And so I do worry about whether we are going to ever get a sympathetic narrative, because archaeologists are portrayed as a bit in a negative sense in the detectorists. So I do wonder what we do about that. All we can do, I think, is I'm the other way I would do it is subvert the narrative. Don't worry about the TV programs. Talk about the archaeology that's all around us via direct social media, as we are doing now, as I try to do on TikTok and via my blog. So currently I'm trying to talk about things like the fact that our most popular new TV series internationally, the most expensive television series ever produced, Rings of Power on Amazon, is all about treasure, and it's all inspired by early medieval treasures, in terms of the Tolkien universe. And that is something, therefore, outside of the real world, where we can engage audiences about the stories and the societies of the past that inspired those stories. And therefore, hopefully, that will indirectly garner a broader appreciation of our historic environment, I would like to imagine. And so I think it's not always one strategy of just banging on about what metal detectors do and don't. It's about trying to get at the issue from various other routes. And I think that we can all do that by not perhaps fixating so much on the TV shows and what they get right and wrong, and more about, well, where do we go next? And what's the next story on the horizon? Because I have a dreadful feeling that we're going to have the TV shows like Digging for Treasure are not going to be our biggest problem in the next 6 months. We're going to have other representations of archaeology that do us more long-term damage.
Yeah, that idea that metal detecting has, as it were, has won the PR war. That I think you're probably right, in so much as archaeologists more often than not are portrayed as in drama killjoys, and in terms of social media interactions, somehow jealous, I suppose. And I mean, a really good example of an archaeologist turning this around. Unfortunately, his name has slipped my mind just for the moment, but was an archaeologist from New Zealand, I believe. Josh Emmett. He's actually Australian, not New Zealand.
Okay.
Who's managed to successfully reach out to a very prominent YouTuber who owns a ghost town called Cerro Gordo in Death Valley, or near Death Valley. And what was interesting about that channel was that from the very beginning, I loved the sense of adventure. I loved and this is where archaeologists and metal detectors and everyone, I think, is very similar. This is a human thing to be stuff obsessed. We're fascinated by things that other people have handled and made, and the stories that come with them. But very quickly, his name's Brent, the owner of the town, fell into a pattern of talking about how he wanted to work with local archaeologists, but actually what he was doing was just magpieing things, putting them into a, quote, museum, which basically was a curio cabinet in the centre of town. And beyond saying this is a dynamite box, or this is a belt buckle, or here's a medicine bottle, he did there were no stories. It was just facts of things. the artifact sort of laid bare, and more or less, I think, was it Flinders Petrie said, murdered evidence in that sense. Charnel houses of murdered evidence.
Yes.
But it's but what's really lovely actually is that by I had commented on his videos in the past and just been sort of imploring him, this is great, really love the adventure, really love what you're doing, but it'd be wonderful if you could just collect a bit more data. And unfortunately, I must have timed it wrong or something, but somehow his fandom just basically said, no, go away. You're a credentialed killjoy. And I was like,
I like that one.
I didn't realize I had
That's something
credentials.
I aspire to be.
No, exactly, yeah. Whereas actually, I genuinely wasn't. And but it's been so lovely now to see an archaeologist. Actually, a conversation is featured in one of his videos where now Brent is geotagging things he finds. He's documenting, and using as the paper. There was a paper that he was pointed to that was YouTube as a form of documentation. I think it was called YouTube as Archaeology. It was really interesting, and I feel as though that has to be the future. That said, though, a couple of days ago, I woke up to TikTok recommending a live stream of some bloke near the, as he put it, the M, blah, 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 because he didn't want to tell us where he was. He was probably next to the A1, I think, in County Durham, metal detecting in a field. And all you had was just the POV shot of the grass, no, deliberately no landscape markers. Yeah. Talking to the crowd, to the audience were really excited about what he was finding and stuff like that. It was Roman coins, I think, one of the things he found. And effortlessly, this guy has 80, 90, 100,000 viewers at a time. So there is a way forward, but there's also some very prominent, very popular, very easily entertaining bad actors out there.
I mean, we haven't talked about TikTok, but may I quickly use that as an example? Is that I think we've got to be Janus-faced in a positive way, as a community, not individually. Some of us are good at fact debunking, and there is a massive audience that love mocking the big creators who spew rubbish. Because while it's frustrating, those big YouTubers and those big TikTokers are there going, guys, it's really amazing, you've got to look at this. And even when they're saying factual things that just end with, here's stuff, I found it on BuzzFeed, and they get 100,000 views, it's very demoralizing. But there is a, and I've cracked a few times and done a few angry TikToks to that effect. But then there is an audience who like I don't know if you come across Dan McClellan, who's a biblical scholar, and he just goes, so someone does something about the Bible and the archaeology or the geology. He covers everything. And he goes, let's go into it, or let's look at show us it. That's what he says. I can't remember his catchphrase, and then he just pulls it apart point by point. No, that's just crazy. Or he does it in the most deadpan way, and people love it. So there's the fact checkers, and the critical, harsh pushback is part of our toolkit. I don't like that myself. I don't sit well with that, but it should be there. There should be a few hard-nosed people. Archeo Wolf is great at this. He's an American professional archaeologist who just pushes back. I don't want to see looting. I don't want to see treasure hunting. This is the reason why you're on state land. You're just stealing. And he's very hard. And I find it it's not my style, but I respect what he does. But there's also the people who need to be showing, do you know what? It's a sad that's now being an ornament on your mock Viking beard, because if you hadn't got that object from a dodgy website, it could still be in a grave. And let's talk about what those graves would have looked like. So in other words, there's different ways we can make those stories. It is so utterly disheartening when you see the scale of imbecility and, the people who will stoop to levels below what any professional could dare do to get attention and get likes. And I'm not saying there's a way of winning against these characters, but I think we have to have an active presence alongside occasional celebrities on TV, the Raksha Daves and the Alex Langlands. They're doing a good job. They're doing their job, but they shouldn't be the only voices in the broader public space. And we do need to have a few angry people. We do need to have a few critical people. We also need people, connecting into some of these channels and saying, hey, why don't you do this? Yes, I'm not saying I would want to be on some of these high profile shows, but we have to have different people trying different strategies to engage.
Interestingly, though, just briefly on that note, he did say, and I won't quote I said personal comments, so I won't quote him without permission directly, but he did say that he took a bit of the one word I'm quoting here is flak from some colleagues over having reached out to someone like Brent. So it's interesting how, you run by finding a way forward.
Yeah,
you do run the risk of colleagues sort of going, "What are you doing? What are you doing? Stop it!" Yeah.
I think that people are very worried about how we're perceived by our own community, and yet we have to get our house in order with this type of thing, because my chapter in the book, going back to the book, is about the Sutton Hoo treasure, and here I'm going down I'm not language police. I get accused all the time of language and tone policing, but I don't believe we should just retire terms, as you know. But equally, I think if we've got to understand that we cannot fight the good fight against looters and metal detectorists if literally simultaneously in our National Museum and in our National Trust heritage sites we have the Sutton Hoo treasure emblazoned over everything without any critical engagement into the funerary story, which a whole massively funded 1980s 90s project by led up by Professor Martin Carver, one of the most internationally renowned research projects at a time before big money went into big research project, excavated that site to put the Mound 1 discovery in context. All that work, and where the original exhibition was really careful about how it used that term, and it's all rolled back. And so my paper is about challenging how the word treasure, which I don't think is necessarily always wrong, has been tied since 1939 to the Mound 1 ship burial assemblage, and is now the way it's being sold. And I think so. My point is that's just one case study, but we can't pretend to speak from any moral high ground if we've got these huge gaps in our own conversations within the professional and museum and academic communities. And so we should be worried about that more than worried about what people think of us, because I think frankly everything I do on social media, and I say I'm an archaeologist, the immediate comeback is but you've all got that stuff stolen in the British Museum. And suddenly, and frankly, it's a difficult one to argue about, again. So I'm not saying we should empty the British Museum. I'm saying that if we don't have a mature conversation within our own community, some of us should be reaching out to these characters, but not everyone, then I think it's a bit hypocritical.
I'm all for returning to the gold cape to Grieg, back to mold, take it back.
Send it home. We want it.
On that uncontroversial note,
Andy's in London, get away from my museum. No,
the Welsh will rise.
Well, actually, I will actually say one of the, and I know I've mentioned this to you before, and I've certainly mentioned it to Howard as well, is that I every year I do a project at the local primary school, and which means I regularly work with kids, for example, of Nigerian heritage, who we are able to take and see and show off a jewel of their culture to the kids of a traditional Southeast London heritage.
That's really great.
And there's a coming together and a sharing and a discussion about whether those things, burning bronzes I'm obviously talking about, should be in the British Museum, or whether all of them, or at least some of them, or whether the BM should acknowledge. We won't start that one now, Mark.
Whether they could be very accurately 3D printed, and the story of the punishment beating that was doled out by the British Empire, and then the recompense was paid back to the Benin collection. That'd be amazing. It would be amazing, and it also would be amazing if the complexities of the current situation in Nigeria that have just been explained in a very interesting article in the Atlantic, which is sort of sometimes glossed over. Absolutely, and there's nothing complicated about the British political landscape at the moment, remotely, is there? No. We're a stable nation. No risk of breakup. And we're a safe place to keep these things. Sorry, Howard. I feel like you've wandered in.
I'll just let you argue.
Exactly. Just quietly go off and make a cup of tea or something. I think actually, we've opened a whole series of other discussions there. And so I think probably now is the time to say thank you to Howard Williams.
Yeah, thank you.
The book that we've been talking about, well, he's talking about most of the time, is called The Public Archaeology of Treasure. It's edited by Howard Williams, our guest, Samuel Clegg, and Peter Evil. It is available from Archaeo Press as part of their Access Archaeology series. And you can buy a traditional paperback for 38 quid, but it is free for personal download. The series is designed to make good quality research accessible and usable, as Howard said at the beginning of our conversation.
Link
People
below.
who know me or read anything I've ever written know how strongly I believe in open access. That modern academic publishing in the traditional form is something of a racket. Discuss.
Yeah. So check out the information below. You'll find it in the video links there. And
absolutely.
And there we are.
Just to thank Howard and his contributors for what I think. Howard said it's not comprehensive. But it's a start, and there are many threads in there which I think people will engage with and enjoy reading, and it'll provoke thought and hopefully more conversation. We've had a conversation here this morning. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks, Howard, for joining us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, both.
Thank you, Howard. And everyone at home, thank you for watching. Do comment below. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ding, ding, ding. Fight!